So, hi, Patricia.
Hey, John.
It's so nice having some time with you.
Yeah,
It
it's
really is.
really great. I've been looking forward to this.
I am too. As I said, although our paths have been very, very different, there's also been some interesting overlaps, particularly in terms of our relationship with the church and in relationship with the Course in Miracles and relationship with this wonderful experience that we all like to talk about called mystical experiences, and how that has opened us up and changed us. And so let's begin, if we can, just with your telling a little bit about the story, about what's in this book, and then beyond this book, because this book ends, what, in 2012?
Yep.
Is that right? Right. So that
Yeah.
was 10 years ago.
Oh my gosh. Yes, it was.
How did that happen? Right?
That hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah,
Wow.
mine was 20 years ago. It's like, what? How did that happen?
It's astonishing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks, John, for
Yeah,
having me on today.
sure.
My book, let me just first speak to the title because
Yeah, good.
the title of this book, Beyond Jesus, I'm going to have to jump ahead in my story kind of to the end and just say something
Okay.
about that, because in 2010, I was driving back to my mother's ash scattering, and at that point I had left the church, and this was actually 2011. I was driving back, and I had left the church at that point, and I didn't know what was ahead, and I was driving through the interstate in Ohio, and I just got this download that I would write a book called Beyond Jesus
Oh.
that would talk about how ego consciousness had shaped Christian belief.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just sat with that for a while, and I didn't know, what form that would take, but it seemed to me that telling my story would be the most effective way of bringing people along on that journey to that realization of how
Mm-hmm.
deeply the consciousness of ego had shaped Christian doctrine and the Christian worldview. So the catalyzing event really in my life, the thing that really set my life on a very different trajectory, was in 2001 with the death of a very close friend of mine. And this was someone I had met in seminary, and we had become very close friends. It was just that, how sometimes you meet someone and you just know, like, this person, I'm supposed to know this person.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that kind of immediate connection. And she died following a transplant for a bone marrow transplant for aplastic anemia. And her death really hit me hard. And there was something, and I think grief can often do this to us. It's like it opens up a moment in our lives. It opens up a portal for us where we can get really clear about things.
Yeah.
And in the wake of her death, I just felt really clear that I did not want to live my life on the surface. And I sensed that there was something about my existence that I had never known. And I just had this clear resolve to know that, whatever that is. And I was going through the grieving process, and a year after her death, I went on spiritual retreat, as I have done every year in February, every year since then. So it's been 20 retreats that I've gone on. And that first year, I reiterated my desire to open up to whatever this consciousness is. And it was a few months after that I started experiencing just all of these impossible synchronicities, these things that were just happening that didn't seem possible. And I felt in that moment like I had stepped into a magical realism novel. Like, these things don't happen.
Yeah.
These just don't happen.
Yeah.
And I felt like my worldview was cracking apart. And I went to the woods where I had gone sort of on weekly pilgrimage just to open myself up to it. And I went to this rock that I sometimes go to meditate. And I just said, it's just like, I don't know what's happening but I just want to surrender to it, and I don't know what to do. And all that occurred to me to do was to start giving thanks for the people in my life. Because somehow I had this sense that whatever was happening in that moment was happening because of my web of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just started giving thanks, saying, thank you for this person. Thank you for that person. And as soon as I started naming the names, I had this immediate flash of knowing that I am not a separate self. It was this moment of absolute recognition that the separate self that I always experienced myself to be did not exist. Mm-hmm. It was a fabrication of my mind.
Wow.
And in that moment, these waves of energy just began cascading through my body. Whoa. It was a very Kundalini kind of physical experience, very intense. And I was sobbing, and I was feeling like something was being released and dying at some deep level of my being at the same time that something was being born. And it was very profound. And I was on this rock and I was sobbing, and, tears were just falling at my feet. And after a while, the energy subsided, and it had been raining during this time. It had been raining. And as the energy began to subside, the rain began to let up. And when I came out of that experience, I saw a world that I had never seen before. I saw the sentience of everything. I saw that everything is alive, that everything is numinous, that everything is interconnected, that everything is love. And I was filled with this profound hope for the earth. And I knew that if enough of us can give ourselves over to this love, that the earth can be healed.
Wow.
And so I was in this state of consciousness, seeing the world as I had never seen it before, knowing myself as I had never known myself before, mm-hmm. experiencing myself to be in love. Everything is just like in love.
Yeah.
So I continued in this heightened state of consciousness for a few days. And during that time, I was getting they felt like downloads of information about how, we are in a story, and it's just, again, synchronicities continued, and the whole thing culminated. It's like, I felt as though I was in a particle accelerator, and things were just accelerating until finally the last vestige of the illusion flew apart in this amazing moment where I recognized that we are in a dream.
Wow.
And at that moment of recognition that we are in a dream, mm-hmm. then all this intensity began to subside. It was just like this clear knowing that we are in a dream, and that we are playing out a story, mm-hmm. that the story itself is a form of trance, and that it's time for us to transform story, mm-hmm. a planetary story.
Wow.
And as I was in the thick of this, and I recognized that what I was experiencing was what Jesus always talked about as the realm of God, or to use, that language, kingdom of God, that this state of consciousness is the realm of God. And I could see how that idea of the separate self that I had seen to be an illusion had in fact shaped our perceptions of Jesus. We had set Jesus apart, mm-hmm. That dualistic mind had set him apart as some sort of different kind of human, separate from us, different from us. We are separate from God. We are separate from the earth. So that that very thing that had been revealed to me to be an illusion was the thing that had formed the foundation of Christian belief. Well, obviously, this put me in a difficult situation in regards to my vocation as a pastor, because I was in a position where, I think it's one thing if you are sitting in the pew of a church, and you can kind of, take what works for you and leave what doesn't. But in the role of pastor, you're expected to represent this doctrinal system.
Right.
And it was no longer true for me.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years, I tried to hold these worlds together, and I tried to find a way that I could integrate them. I tried to find a way where I could maybe reframe, Christianity for myself. I tried really hard, John. I tried so hard because, for one thing, I had a magnificent congregation that I just dearly loved, a very progressive congregation in Philadelphia. They'd been on the forefront of so many progressive movements and very, social justice oriented, and just besides that, just dear, dear folks. So this is my beloved spiritual community, and so it, I didn't want to leave.
Of course.
So I tried to hang on, and I went on all these sort of pilgrimages. I took a pilgrimage to England and to Scotland. I thought, well, maybe if I go to Iona in Scotland, where they practice a Celtic form of Christianity, maybe that can be what I can hang on to. So I took a trip to Iona, and even there, I didn't find what I needed. And I took a trip to Israel, which actually I was invited to go on, and it's like these experiences just ended up alienating me more and more, and eventually,
the kingdom of heaven is inside you.
Say again.
I said the kingdom of heaven is inside you.
Yeah, exactly. And I really wanted somehow to make the institution work for me, and it just became more and more clear that it wouldn't, and it couldn't. It has its own architecture of belief. So anyway, in 2009, I made yet another pilgrimage back to California, to the place where Patricia had died, to the place, that was the name of my friend, Patricia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The place where she had died, where we had scattered her ashes. I went back to the seminary that we had both graduated from, and where I also had met my husband. So I made this pilgrimage back, and when I was there, it was very clear to me. I was at the seminary, and I was walking a labyrinth there that had been installed since our graduation.
Mm-hmm.
Walking the labyrinth has also been an important part of my spiritual practice. And as I walked that labyrinth, and I got to the middle of the labyrinth, and I looked up at the bell tower of the chapel, where we always had our chapel services. And I felt this blessing for me in my path, I'll use that word. And I felt that something was completed, that some chapter of my life was done. And when I came back to Philadelphia to resume my responsibilities as a pastor, again, there were all these synchronicities. I walked in, well, first of all, I couldn't get my office door open. The key wouldn't work. I'd had this key for 12 years, no problems ever, but I'm trying to open the door. I can't get my office door open. When I finally do, jiggle the lock and get my door open, what I witness inside my office is many of my books have been removed from my bookshelves. They're stacked on the floor. all of these portraits of former pastors of the church, dating back to the 1800s, had been pulled out from this corner where they've been in storage, and they're leaning up against the sofa. And I open the door, and it looks like my office is being packed up, and all of these old, former pastors are there saying, "Come join us." And I realized I had this recognition. Oh, it's time for me to go.
Oh my gosh.
And there was something in me that just was done with that role, and I couldn't reactivate it. I just, it's like this chasm opened up between me and the responsibilities of the pastorate. And so at that same time that I realized it was time for me to leave the church and this beloved spiritual community, I also learned that my mother was in hospice, and she had cancer. It had recurred. And so I was faced with these two very monumental losses in my life at the same time, the death of my mother and the death of, my mother church. So that was a really rough time. And I stayed with my mother some to accompany her, and then I resigned. And anyway, so it was in the aftermath of all of that I was driving back then to participate in my mother's ash scattering, that I got this knowing that I would write this book called Beyond Jesus, to talk about how ego consciousness had shaped Christian belief. So there's a lot more that I could say about my story.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't even touch on, my time in Ecuador as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 80s, and my experiences in doing nonviolent civil disobedience, for which I spent a week in prison when the U.S. launched the invasion of Iraq. And of course, all those things factor in, but that's kind of the key points, I guess, of the constellation that I'll offer this time.
Right. So could you then share with us a little bit about how you came to A Course in Miracles? Because most of the folks who are with us are students of A Course in Miracles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So shortly after I had resigned from the church, well, first of all, I had before I left the church, I was trying to write a very serious book, and I was going to call it Quantum Christianity, because I'd become interested in quantum physics, and I'd become interested in how quantum physics, it seemed to me, was uncovering some of what I thought Jesus was getting at. So I tried really hard to write this serious book, and I'd done a sermon series called Quantum Christianity. So I thought I have kind of the material there. I can just kind of rework it. But it was just going nowhere. And I was so, it just felt laborious to me. So finally it's like, all right, I'm just going to, whatever. I'm just going to write whatever wants to come through. I'm going to let go of control. So I let it go. And I just sat down to start writing. And the words that came forth, much to my surprise, were "once upon a no time." And it launched into this fable that was very much about what I had come to understand as a result of my own mystical experiences, and touched on exactly what I'd been trying to communicate about ego and us being in a dream, and what it means when someone awakens in the dream. So I wrote this book, and it's called No One in Island. Well, someone, and I don't even know how this happened, but someone up in Connecticut got a hold of this. I think I put it on my website or something. And he asked me to come up and speak to a group in his church in Connecticut who had read this little story. And so we went out to dinner before the group met, and he leaned across the restaurant booth and he said, sort of in this hushed voice, speaking of my story, he said, "It sounds a lot like A Course in Miracles."
Oh.
And I was like, "Oh, I've never read the Course." And to be honest, I didn't have any desire to read A Course in
Sure.
Miracles. I had my own preconceptions, although I knew nothing about it. But I had my own preconceptions about it.
Yes, right.
Like, this is weird, it's like weird, and I'm not weird, so that's not for me.
Right.
So anyway, okay, that was my first like little nudge. And then in 2014, so this is probably a couple years later, I was on retreat to mark the anniversary of my friend Patricia's death. I was at a hermitage up at Medical Mission Sisters has their global headquarters outside of Philadelphia. And they have these little hermitages that you can use. So I was there and I was getting ready for my retreat. And I was moving some books off of one shelf so that I could put my books up. And as I'm moving these books off, they tumble to the floor. And among them is, as I'm picking them up, among them is this booklet, Introduction to A Course in Miracles. So I'm like, all right. So I sat down and I started reading it. And I was blown away.
If I can interrupt for a second, I can tell you how many times I've heard this story. And multiple times it fell off a shelf. I was dusting the bookcase and I bought it 15 years ago, couldn't get into it. I've actually had people, more than one, several people tell me it actually like jumped off the shelf, which that sounds like magic now. That's not miracles, but the fact that it, as I say, it comes to each of us at the time it's supposed to come to us. And boy, was it the right time for you.
It was absolutely the right time for me. And the reason that it blew me away, John, was it was confirming the things that I had experienced. 10 years, 12 years before that.
Especially the dream part, right? I mean, that's really...
And that's the thing. When I got to that, it's like that we're in a dream. It's like,
right.
Oh.
Right.
Because that was really, at the time when I was having those experiences, I didn't know what to do with them. And I didn't have any guidance or, any way to help me understand. Like that was another big challenge. So it was extremely comforting to come upon this resource that was confirming what I had come to see. And so when I got back from my retreat, obviously I ordered a course and I started reading. So Beyond Jesus ends, the time period that book covers ends in 2012. And it was 2014 then that I was introduced to the course.
Could you explain to us a little bit more about what you mean by ego consciousness getting a hold of the church? I mean, I'm in agreement with you, but how do you see that and how that was manifest and your answer?
Yeah. And I don't, there's no, obviously, as we know, if we're studying the course and are practitioners of that, and there's no blame here. It's
no.
People were interpreting Jesus' life and teachings through the lens of their present consciousness.
Sure.
They were making sense of it in the way that it could make sense to them. And so when I use the term ego consciousness, really what I'm talking about is the dualistic consciousness, the consciousness, the separateness, the paradigm of separateness. So if we are in that dualistic mind, then we look at Jesus and we see something amazing and other than us.
Yes. Right.
And that's when we end up projecting our divine nature onto him. So he becomes the only Son of God.
Right.
He becomes, the savior that we need for our depraved, our depraved essence
Sure.
as fallen humanity. So there's all of this projection that the egoic mind does, and it happened with Jesus. So he becomes the object of our projection of our own true nature.
Right.
And there are probably lots of ways that I could talk about that, but I'll leave it at that.
So what it really means is our awakening to the realization that you are the Christ. No, I'm the Christ, that we're the Christ.
Exactly.
Christ is one mind, and that we all very much a part of that mind.
Exactly. To know ourselves as Jesus knew himself to be Christ.
Right.
That is what we are. That's it. That is what we are. That's our essence.
Right.
Yeah.
So he awoke to that. I always sort of see that as happening in the wilderness story. I mean, that's really the real temptation is. And he comes out of that.
Yeah.
And then begins the ministry. There's no ministry till after that event. But
that's the way I see it too. And actually that's the story in the Gospels that I was really turning to when I was in the midst of this very tumultuous awakening experience.
Right.
That story of him being baptized, coming up out of the river.
Right.
And seeing heaven and earth, the veil of separateness was torn apart.
Right.
And he knew himself to be completely and absolutely beloved.
Right.
He knew that was who he was, and that anything else was an illusion, including Rome, the empire, and all of that was an illusion.
Right.
So, and then, he had to undergo this process of facing those egoic temptations in himself.
Right.
That I think is so key, because we don't go from that kind of experience to then going out and proselytizing. There's this experience of purification that we undergo, because otherwise we're probably the ego is going to take that awakening experience and gonna make a lot of hay out of that and make itself very special.
Like create bishops and archbishops.
Yeah. I've had this experience. Doesn't this make me special?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, do you know that quote from Meister Eckhart, what you said, that your experience of, you were giving thank you for this friend and that friend? Do you know that quote from Meister? If the only prayer you ever say is thank you, that's enough.
That's enough. That's enough.
And that's what got you started.
Absolutely. It was being in this pure state of gratitude. And as I look back at that experience, I realized that what I was doing in that moment, I already had a recognition of the fundamental nature of reality being relationship. There was something in me that knew enough to know that what I was experiencing somehow had to do with relationships.
The whole course is about relationship. It's about, letting go of all of our projections onto our others and engaging in the process of forgiveness of ourselves, A, and then B, for whatever else we think somebody else did to us that never happened. And it's a wonderful awakening. And it doesn't have to happen with the course. I mean, the course is a book. It's a facilitator.
Yeah.
It helps the process, especially the workbook lessons, helps us to maintain and sustain that consciousness, that awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd also like to add that it also doesn't need to have some sort of dramatic.
Oh, goodness, no.
I had sometimes, in some ways that makes it more difficult to have an experience like that.
Why?
Because first of all, it's very disorienting.
Oh.
It's very jarring to the system.
Yeah.
It's not gentle.
No.
It kind of reminds me, John, of what you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
about the dynamite, opening up the portal with dynamite. It
Right.
doesn't have to be like that, you know?
No, it doesn't.
It
But
can
that
be
was
it can
was
be gentle and gradual like the dawn, like the sun coming up,
yeah.
like these gentle realizations of who we are.
That's when it comes as dynamite that it shakes you, and then you really sort of see it, but you sort of stand back and you look at it, and you
Yeah,
it's a dream, but it's also a nightmare.
absolutely.
And that part isn't fun to see,
Yeah, that's right.
especially in terms of our own contribution to the creation of the nightmare.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
right.
right. Yeah, and the implications of this recognition that we're in a dream.
Yeah,
And you don't change a dream by trying to change the dream.
right.
You don't change the dream by trying to, go out there and fix it.
You can't
The
manipulate it.
dream is here. You change a dream by changing the mind that's
That's right.
dreaming. And so more and more, it's like this, again, the retracting the projections, right? And coming to recognize, well, as you know, having read my book, dreams have played a very figural role
Oh yeah,
in my own
a
spirit.
lot.
Yeah. And I had a dream recently, well, when I was on retreat, just this past month,
Yeah.
where there's this like demonstration that's happening. And I don't know if it's around climate change or what, but there's there are a bunch of people who are walking, engaged in some kind of a, not protest, but demonstration, some kind. And I'm walking in the other direction, and I recognize that I want to get to the headwaters of the climate crisis, where it originates in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I'm about, like get to the headwaters of this nightmare that we see playing out on the earth, because that's where it starts. And to recognize that what that means is for me to travel to my own headwaters, into my, into the depths of my own consciousness, because that's where it starts. Like that's my fundamental responsibility. That's my work to do.
So I say the kingdom of heaven is inside you.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the course says that it modifies it because it says the kingdom of heaven is you.
Yeah. Yes.
It's not just inside you. You are it. It is you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, this is wonderful. The other thing that I really liked what you just said was we're talking about the Jesus story, the baptism and all that. The Course in Miracles, principle number 7, you're probably familiar with it because it's right there in the beginning. It's such a clear one. Miracles, everyone's right, but purification is necessary first.
Yeah.
First we got to clean house. First we got to get the junk out before we can see. How can you say there's a beam in your eye when there's a speck in your eye when there's a beam in your own eye?
Exactly.
Yeah. Take that beam out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly. Very interesting line, and then you will see clearly how to help somebody else. So that's what we're doing. I mean, that's the process that we're all engaged in.
Absolutely.
We're cleaning out our own vision, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as the Course, helps us to do that, absolutely free of judgment.
Oh yes.
So often we can clean our house with a lot of judgment. Yeah. And then we're not really cleaning house, we're using that same energy that doesn't, right. The whole thing of forgiveness and recognizing that, that's the other thing about dreams is we're not punished for what we have dreamed. When we wake up in the morning and we've had a dream where we did something that I was like, yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, those are tough ones.
And that's the other thing, when you mentioned about, how the Course came to me, and I told you the story of the introduction that I came upon, not only was it confirming what I understood, that we're in a dream, but it was taking it it was helping me see the full implications of that, especially how it plays out in terms of forgiveness. I hadn't gone to that step in my own awareness. But if this is a dream, we are not judged for what we dream because it's not happening in reality. And I had not made that leap of understanding.
Right.
And that's where the Course really like, oh, wow.
Yeah. I love the part of your mystical experience too, that where you started seeing the love
Yeah.
that was for happening for everyone. I mean, that's beautiful when you get to that place.
Yeah.
And the connectivity.
Yes.
And the fact that there's just one mind, the fact that there's just one of us here.
Right.
I mean, if you see that, then you can't engage in projection. I mean, you can't, or you're projecting to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And now we have an opportunity to share with each other and with Patricia. Bud is going to, first of all, tell us a little bit about what he's seeing going on in the chat room. And then we'll move over to having dialogue with Patricia. Go ahead, Bud.
Here we have a couple of really wonderful, warm questions. So one of them, Ted brought to the forefront by saying, this is a very moving account, and it leads him to ask, how does this play in regard to healing the crisis of the war in Ukraine?
Super good question. Patricia?
Yeah, it is. It's, I think it's a question a lot of us are sitting with right now. And, when I was on, again, retreat one year, I like to go to Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico, and they have this fabulous, gorgeous labyrinth outdoors that is right in front of this beautiful red cliff. And I love to walk it when I'm there. And one day I was walking the labyrinth without any question that I was holding. I was just open, and I was walking the labyrinth, and I, hear the words here. I hear these words, release all concept of enemy. And it was, I hadn't been thinking about enemies, but it sort of startled me. Release all concept of enemy. And then it went on and it said, there are no enemies. There are only those who do not know who they are.
Right.
And so for me, one of the foundational things as we look at what's happening in our nightmare in Ukraine, the Ukrainian nightmare is, first of all, to release all concept of enemy and to recognize that the whole idea of enemy is egoic and dualistic. And so for me, when I as an individual cannot stop what's happening in Ukraine. I do, however, believe that this can be an invitation for all of us to extend love in whatever ways we can.
Right.
And we're doing that today by donating all of the proceeds from the registrations towards refugee relief. After we're off the call, I'm going to the Ukrainian League of Philadelphia, that's only a couple blocks from our house, where they're having a fundraising bake sale. And we're going to go buy some pierogies and probably give a substantial donation on top of that. Mm-hmm. This can be an opportunity for us to express love in wildly creative ways. And I think, John, this might have been in one of your books where you quoted Helen Keller, who said, the world is full of suffering and it's also full of the overcoming of suffering.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so, to hold everything that's happening for me in my heart, to hold it in that reality of love, and to do whatever I can do to help alleviate the suffering. That's what I feel called to. John, you can chime in however you want to.
Well, I'm really totally in agreement with you. It's important to think about how this transforms me and how I see things, how I don't see enemies. At the same time that I don't see enemies, let's say I'm an adult and I walk into a room and there's a couple of kids that are fighting and one's beating the other one up. I will stop it.
Yeah.
I mean, I will step forward. I say, no, this is not right. You can't be beating up this other child. So something has to happen where we don't. There's a really important. The fact is, it's just a section we've been going through in the course right now. If you began the first of the year, in defenselessness, my safety lies. Right. So, but that in that defenselessness, I think we should understand that on an ego level, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't defend your body. If somebody walks up to you on the street and starts attacking your body, you will do everything in your power to stop them. For one very simple reason. Within the context of the dream, you think you're a body. I mean, it certainly looks like this thing is real, so let's not deny. Of course, they do not deny the seeming reality of the body. So here it is within the context of the dream. So we have to do what we can about. I think we are doing what we can by, helping with the refugee relief. But where else? What has to change in me also in terms of the way I see? That's very important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would also encourage people to. I, for a long time, have been very interested in nonviolence and
Right.
the power of nonviolence and what nonviolence can actually do in the world. And I think we all, look to the example of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And I would recommend people go to, there's the Metta Center for Nonviolence. It's METTA. Michael Nagler is the person who founded that, and he wrote a book called The Search for a Nonviolent Future. I believe that nonviolence is the way for us to move forward as a human society. And so that's, something that I try to cultivate in my own life.
Yeah, how can I be nonviolent? In my mind.
Yes, exactly.
to start with.
To begin it within the mind and then let that be expressed in the actions. Yeah.
Right. There's a line there, of course, I could see peace instead of this. There's a basic teaching in the course. Well, how do we see peace and when we're standing in the middle of a war? Right? It's possible. I mean, it's possible to know the kingdom of heaven is inside, and it's possible to know it's a dream, and it's possible to know that it's insanity, but that doesn't mean we don't feel a need to correct not only the way we see, but to extend beyond that if we can.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. What else, bud?
Well, since we're talking about the war, Ted added another comment. Is there a place for giving miracles in responding to the war?
You want to start?
I'd like you to start.
Well, the giving of the miracle, I think, starts with giving love, regardless, at all times and in all places, regardless of whatever it is that's going on. So it's very hard to know how one loves Putin, but there's a transcendent dimension that you can get to. How does God see Putin, right? I mean, God sees Putin as a child of God. Maybe at the moment, a kind of chaotic thing that seems to be going on within the context of the world. But that's not true in eternity, which I think is hard for us to understand. It's hard for us to understand not true in eternity. In eternity, we are all one, even this part of us that seems to be a disease element within the context of the human consciousness. But how do we love our way around that? That's the real challenge.
Yeah.
But that's going really deep. The course is really deep. You go all the way down. It's not about killing anybody, doing anything like that. But again, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean that we don't let murderers murder. We don't let rapists rape. We don't let thieves steal. Yeah. And somehow or another, we have to do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say also, in addition to that, in answer to the question for me, well, you already touched on this, John, but the miracle is really, the change of perception. And
right.
For me to experience the miracle and be the miracle is for me to perceive, as you're saying, perceive all of the players in this saga, all of them in their original innocence, in their essential innocence, in their essential goodness.
Right.
And, I do believe that if enough of us, because consciousness is one, right? If enough of us are holding a different state of consciousness, that has an effect on the dream. Because we are changing the mind that's dreaming. And as we step out of this narrative of violence, out of this narrative of enemy, out of this narrative of other, as we ourselves step out of that and hold a different state of consciousness, we are influencing the dream, because the dream is arising from the mind.
Right. So the question then becomes, how do we love in this situation?
Exactly.
Right. I had an experience when I was in seminary. I actually roomed with a fellow who later became a serial killer, not a divinity student. He just died quite recently, but I got to know him before any of that had ever happened in his life, and I got to know him as this kind of innocent person who wound up doing some pretty horrific things in his life. But with the ability to sort of reach back and see that little boy that was in there, that child that was in there, who was horribly hurt when he was 7 years old. His brother committed suicide, which is what led to his insanity, I think. I mean, it was a major contributing factor, right? And it takes a lot to sometimes reach back to that.
Yeah.
But, the question is, how does God see this situation?
Right.
How does God see? Remember the bombing in Boston? What was it, several years ago now?
The marathon bombing, yeah.
I was at a church the very next day. That was on a Friday, Saturday. I think I wasn't on a Sunday. I was speaking at a church somewhere. And I did an impromptu sermon. I tossed out whatever I had planned. And what I did instead was, the topic was the boy in the boat. Remember, he was found in a boat, and it was covered up in a boat. And I said, what is the boy in the boat? What is he going? How does God see the boy in the boat? All right. What's God's response to the boy in the boat? But here we got this if we're measuring things in degrees, it's way beyond that, but it's not. It's the same kind of a thing. All right. Then the question is, how do we see the boy in the boat? I know a lot of people are after him for big time.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, it's okay.
Well, that same event, the Boston Marathon bombing, as soon as I heard of it, I went down to the place where I meditate and downstairs, and I sat down on the cushion, and I was intending to pray for the people of Boston and the victims, and as soon as I began, I felt like something was just taking over my body and my mind that wanted to hold the perpetrators. Like there was this very strong desire to pray for the perpetrators, and I just let this power use me, because as we know, everything is either an expression of love or a cry for love, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You got more, Bud, before we go to the hands up?
I just want to add a comment here, because this is so pertinent in world events. Chapter 23 of the course, section 4, is all about the battle. And it's a section I try to read every year. We're clearly instructed to rise above the battleground of the ego.
Right.
And what's startling to me, as I really dug into that concept years ago and continue to go back and explore it, is how the concept of attack is defined and how we attack without realizing it. As an example, not forgiving, which I know I have done, is the same as attack. And that's a bit of a zinger.
Yeah.
And further, and again, remember, when we're looking at the notion of the illusion, all attack is the same as murder. It's equated very directly in the Course. So even an unconscious attack, wishing that the other person is dead, is what I'm doing. That's really what I'm suggesting in my unconscious mind, in my egoic thinking of the world. If I can't forgive, then that's what I'm offering. And so what does that mean when we attack ourselves by not forgiving our own thoughts, our own words, our own deeds?
Yeah.
Right?
That's the place to start, isn't it?
Yes. And it really has to start here. It isn't really about all these things that occur on the surface of our life when we're looking at all of this notion of whatever's happening in the world. And there's always something. There's never nothing in this world. This world is a learning institution.
Yeah.
It all has to come back to us. How do I feel about that? What miracle can I perform in my life? That's how I extend love to everyone. We're all one. When I extend love to even myself or others, I'm adding to the love of the world. And the best way we can love ourselves is to forgive ourselves. If I can't forgive another, it's because there's some aspect of me I can't forgive. That's where we start. That's my humble opinion.
Yeah, you're right. That's where we start. And how do we start there? In even really small ways, right?
So here's a couple of questions. And we do have some people with their hands up. And so I want to get to those as well in a couple of minutes, but we still have a few more questions. So Jean wants to know, how do we align for the extension of peace and love for all? And do you have any tips from the awareness that this is a dream? And how can we apply that, especially if we haven't had that notion of, like both of you talked about, your awakening experiences, right? So how can I move forward as if, so that I could extend peace and love?
Can you read the first part of that again? How do we align
for the extension of peace and love for all?
Align,
A-L-I-G-N, align.
Yeah. So I want to skip to the end of that around, if when we haven't had the experience of this aha, that this is a dream, let me just say that I did have that experience, but that doesn't mean that I stayed there. It's sort of like the alarm clock goes off and it's like, oh, and then, you hit the snooze button and then you're back in the dream.
But one thing I might add there, you don't forget that you had that experience.
But you don't forget that you've had the experience.
Because you had the experience, that tells you could go back to it. It's a memory that you want to hold on to.
That's very true.
And come back to. And
right. That's
it remains in the background.
That is the difference. That is the difference.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, if you haven't had the recognition at that kind of immediate revelatory way that this is a dream, people practice lucid dreaming. They practice to become lucid, and when I go to sleep at night, I don't practice lucid dreaming, but some people do. And there are practices that you can do, like you look at your palm. Every time you see your palm during the day, you say to yourself, this is a dream. This is a dream. And then when you're in a dream and you look at your palm, you go, oh, this is a dream. So there are ways to practice lucidity. But I think really it all comes down to, so this is a dream. How do we want to be in this dream? Whether we're aware of it or not, how do we want to be in it? How do we want to express love? How do we want to let our being express itself in love? So there's this back and forth of knowing it's a dream and not believing that. And I know that both of those things play out in my own psyche. Like part of me knows that this is a dream and another part of me is still in the dream. So it does go back and forth. But
and sometimes too, I find, Patricia, you have to just let the dream be the dream.
Yeah. And not fight it. That's the thing that keeps us locked in the dream, I think, more than anything, is fighting against it.
Right. So let's say you're with somebody else who's being very disagreeable with you, and so you just let them be who they are. And, you don't interfere. You don't try to fix it or change it. And, that would be silly to do that. Then you are trying to fix the dream.
Yeah, and then you're making it real for yourself and the person.
Right.
You're giving it solidity in the mind.
That's right. Then you're forgetting it's a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bud, you want to go to some of the other questions?
So we've got, Joe has a question, and then we can go to the hands. So that'd be great.
Okay.
So what do you see as the most effective way to balance, teach, or explain the fact that this is all a dream with the reality that we are of inestimable value and worth to our Creator?
Right. So the dream self. So you're seeing on your Zoom screen, depictions of John and representations. These are representations of a self that is not the self that we are, is not, this thing that you're seeing. And so the fact that that we are in a dream and we're all characters in this dream, playing our roles in this dream, doesn't mean that the essential self is invaluable. The essential self is eternal. The essential self is the expression as an idea of God. And then we put on these costumes in the dream. And the dream itself, as I see it, my take on the dream that we're playing out on planet Earth is that we come to a recognition of who we are. We come to a recognition of our divinity. And then what we get to do in the dream is play with that and express it, so that the dream itself becomes not an expression of the illusion of the egoic mind, but it becomes a representation of the reality of love. So that the dream becomes like a masterpiece, if you will, a masterpiece of the imagination when it has aligned itself with love. And that, I believe, is the highest purpose of this world, is that it become, if it's a dream, it's never going to be real. So we're not going to make it reality. That's what the ego's been trying to do for a long time. It's try to make this dream a reality. It's not possible. But what the dream can be is a beautiful, symbolic representation of the reality.
The Course talks about this in terms of the happy dream. You can
Yes.
dream. It's a dream of awakening.
Yes.
I'm dreaming that I'm waking up. And as a part of that process, what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to extend love to all my brothers and sisters that I'm meeting within the context of the dream. I'm doing those kind of things which facilitate this process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not out of the dream, but there's a door over there, and I'm headed toward that. One of the things I like said, the foot is on the path. I am headed home. That's the good news. I'm not going into a nightmare here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm awakening from nightmare.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's 5 after, and thank you, Patricia. And
thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.
Turning the tables in May, and thank you all for being here.